Since medieval times, the prisoner of war has been a byproduct of human conflict. Usually he is faceless to all but his relatives and friends, although his general circumstances and treatment may achieve renown. The Vietnam War produced its share of prisoners. More than 650 Americans were captured between 1964 and 1973. But these prisoners did not remain faceless. As year after year passed, virtually every American came to know the name of at least one prisoner, one lonely wife, or one fatherless child, because some of these prisoners were in captivity for nearly 9 years, longer than any POWs in any other war. During that time, they grew from a few forgotten Americans in an obscure Asian prison to the central figures in the final disengagement of United States forces. This is the story of their captivity.
This is a reconstruction of a prison cell in the Hanoi Hilton. Very likely one of the first cells which a newly captured prisoner of war would see. It's a solitary or a solo cell used for isolating POWs. Isolation was a common pressure exerted on U.S. POWs in North Vietnam, with almost all of them spending some months in solitary, and a few as much as 4 years. One newly captured pilot spent his first 1,000 days in isolation, much of it in a cell like this. In the next few minutes, we're going to look in more detail at the conditions of captivity. That is, the physical aspects of the POW environment, the cells, the food, the prison camps themselves, and the treatment afforded by the captor, the interrogations, the physical, and the psychological pressures. More than 650 Americans were captured in Southeast Asia between 1964 and 1973, with by far the greatest number being captured in North Vietnam. Nearly all of these men were Air Force and Navy pilots, most of them captured during the bombing over North Vietnam from 1966 to 1968. Those captured in South Vietnam were generally Army and Marine Corps personnel, but as we will see, very few of them were confined in South Vietnam. Instead, they were moved north into prison camps in the Hanoi area. In Laos, U.S. rescue forces recovered many more downed airmen, and there were correspondingly fewer prisoners. Only 9 men were returned by the Pathet Lao. These men had spent only a few weeks in Laos before they too were moved into North Vietnam for detention. None of these captives from Laos or South Vietnam were ever acknowledged as POWs by North Vietnam until the 1973 ceasefire. Of 122 U.S. prisoners returned by the Viet Cong, only 28 were actually released in South Vietnam. These men were all captured in this general area and never moved far from a series of camps in the border regions of South Vietnam and Cambodia. The other POWs released by the Viet Cong had all been captured north of Dalat City and then moved into North Vietnam for detention. These men were sometimes moved in large groups, as were the 41 POWs taken during the Tet Offensive of early 1968, while others were moved either individually or in small groups of 2 to 3 men. Virtually all followed a northward course, something like this, through the Ho Chi Minh Trail network.
The environment for those POWs held in South Vietnam was primitive. Camps generally consisted of bamboo cages, small huts or bunkers. Life was hard. The prisoners were often bound or chained for long periods, not as deliberate maltreatment, but as a security measure. Their treatment was usually based on individual camp policy. What happened in one camp had no noticeable effect on treatment in other camps. Movement of the prisoners was frequent and often involved walking for weeks between campsites. Major R.C. Schrump of the Army was held in 12 different camps during 5 years of captivity. The prisoners' daily routine, which usually consisted of simply surviving from day to day without amenities of any sort, varied little. Exposure to the elements posed a chronic health threat, and medical treatment by trained doctors was virtually non-existent, although some of the Viet Cong served as medical aides. The prisoners suffered constantly from malnutrition, complicated by frequent attacks of dysentery, dermatitis, and malaria. Over the years, 1 out of 5 men captured died in captivity. Generally, it was more difficult to survive captivity in South Vietnam, but on the other hand, it was not so difficult to escape from camps in the South as from those in the North. There were 26 successful escapes in South Vietnam, representing more than 12% of the PWs captured.
This is Hanoi, ultimate destination for nearly all of the Americans captured in Southeast Asia. Lying some 60 miles inland at the core of the Red River Delta, the city contains more than 1 million Vietnamese and is still studded with 8th century pagodas as well as more recent remnants of the French administration. One of these 20th century architectural remains is Hoa Lo Prison, built by the French in the early 1900s. It occupies an entire city block in downtown Hanoi, just across the street from the Ministry of Justice. Hoa Lo Prison quickly became known as the Hanoi Hilton in the early days of the war, when U.S. prisoners were held in this corner of the camp, while the rest of it was used for Vietnamese criminals. American POWs eventually devised nicknames for 3 major sections of the prison installation. In 1967, the original Hanoi Hilton became known as Little Vegas, when the POWs sardonically named their cells and cell blocks after Las Vegas casinos, Thunderbird, the Mint, Riviera, Stardust, and others. The adjacent corner of the camp was first known simply as Heartbreak, because most interrogations were conducted here. In 1971, it acquired another nickname, New Guy Village, because newly captured POWs, or New Guys, received initial processing in this area. The third and largest section of the prison, opened in late 1970 after the raid on the Son Tay POW camp, became known as Camp Unity, because here all U.S. POWs were housed together for the first time. It was composed of 9 large, open-bay cell blocks surrounding an interior courtyard and exercise area, and could hold as many as 400 prisoners.
A total of 13 camps were used to confine U.S. POWs in North Vietnam. 8 of these were located outside the city of Hanoi, generally to the west. The Briar Patch, for example, was opened in 1966 in conjunction with the war crimes program being conducted at that time. The North Vietnamese moved some 50 prisoners into this camp and subjected them to continuing pressure in an effort to force them to confess to war crimes against the people of North Vietnam. Dan Hoi Barracks, or Camp Faith as the prisoners called it, was the largest camp opened outside of Hanoi, housing more than 200 POWs in the last months of 1970. During this time, the prisoners experienced communal living for the first time, following nearly 6 years of continuing effort to isolate them as much as possible. Another camp, nicknamed Dog Patch, was unusual in 2 ways. First, it was located far from Hanoi and within 10 miles of the Chinese border in a relatively inaccessible area of North Vietnam. Secondly, unlike any other camp used in North Vietnam, it was heavily camouflaged even at ground level so that local villagers would not know of the presence of American POWs. This was probably to ensure that these prisoners would not be lost to a U.S. rescue effort in the last months of the war. Finally, this is a Son Tay camp as it looked in 1969. The small, isolated compound, located nearly 25 miles west of Hanoi and outside of the North Vietnamese heavy anti-aircraft defenses, was a nearly perfect target for a rescue attempt. On November 20, 1970, a small helicopter-borne assault force landed in the camp, hoping to rescue some 50 POWs thought to be held there. Unfortunately, although the raid was executed without complication, the prisoners had routinely been moved to another camp about 15 miles away. Continued activity by Vietnamese remaining in the area produced all the outward signs of an active prison camp, so that the raid was launched against an empty compound.
Immediately after the raid, the North Vietnamese hurriedly evacuated all camps outside of Hanoi and moved all prisoners into the Camp Unity portion of the Hanoi Hilton. As we will see later, this centralization of POWs forced the captor to abandon his efforts at isolating and separating the prisoners, and for the first time allowed the POWs to organize effectively. In general, treatment of U.S. prisoners in North Vietnam can be characterized as falling into one of three major periods. From the capture of the first POWs in mid-1964 until late in 1965, there was little physical mistreatment or torture. To be sure, the POWs were interrogated for military information, but these interrogations, while using physical inducements such as denial of food and sleep, would not be characterized as brutal, inhumane, or even unusual. But in the fall of 1965, the Vietnamese attitude toward interrogation changed. Not only had their former interrogation techniques failed to produce much usable information, but the North Vietnamese administration had also launched a new effort to exploit POWs for propaganda purposes. Without dire coercion, prisoners were not likely to sign the confessions and the apologies demanded by the captor. And as a consequence, the Vietnamese started a torture program, which was to last for nearly 4 years.
Torture has been defined as the application of pain so intense as to cause loss of consciousness or will. Much of the physical abuse begun by the North Vietnamese in late 1965 fits this definition. Often the prisoners would be forced to, in effect, torture themselves by being made to stand, sit, or kneel for unbearably extended periods. One prisoner was forced to lean against a wall from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. for 6½ days. Another sat on a stool without food or water for over 3 days. When a man passed out, or feigned passing out, he was beaten back into position. The worst physical abuse, however, was that applied directly by the captor, whose favorite accessories were ropes, iron bars, and foot stocks, which he combined in a variety of ways. Prisoners were frequently fastened by their ankles in stocks. Then their hands were handcuffed behind their backs and their arms bound together with rope from wrist to elbow. Then a longer rope could be run from the prisoner's arms, around his body, and through the iron bar at his feet to force him into a variety of trussed positions depending on the strength and imagination of the guards. In one variation, the rope was tied to the prisoner's elbows and then tossed over a rafter so that the prisoner's entire body could be hoisted off the floor. In some cells, foot stocks were used to secure the prisoner to his bed. It was a simple matter for the guards to turn these stocks into an even more rigorous instrument of torture. Floggings were another common form of torture prior to 1969. Prisoners were bound to tables or even trees and then beaten with bamboo sticks or thin strips of rubber cut from old truck tires until they lost consciousness. In some floggings, the prisoner was lashed 800 to 1,000 times. Physical punishments like these were generally combined with isolation, denial of food and sleep, withholding of medical care, and general harassment. Even when mistreatment was commonplace for nearly all prisoners, the captor generally tried to cite a moral justification for the torture. Most commonly, he would create a convenient accusation that one of the camp regulations had been broken. The offending prisoner would be punished for his alleged violation and then allowed to atone for his sins by offering some information or propaganda the captor desired. This was one of the many uses of the camp rules imposed during the earliest days of confinement to form a daily program of humiliation and harassment of the POWs.
All U.S. aggressors caught red-handed in their piratical attack against the Democratic Republic of Vietnam are criminals. While detained in this camp, you will strictly obey the following rules. All criminals will bow to all Vietnamese in the camp. All criminals must show polite attitude at all times, or they will be severely punished. All criminals will truthfully answer orally or in writing any question, or do anything directed by the camp authority. Criminals are forbidden to attempt to communicate with each other in...
Following these 4 years of very harsh conditions, the third and final period of treatment began in October 1969. This period, the final 3 years of captivity, saw an end to heavy torture and the beginning of lighter punishment, better food, and generally improved living conditions. There's been much speculation as to the cause of this change, but it was probably due in large measure to pressure by both American and international public opinion, which reached a crescendo during 1969 and 1970. Additionally, the Vietnamese were finding that POW resistance was frustrating many of their propaganda efforts, and that the world at large was labeling their few successes as pure propaganda. Also, a number of prisoners were sick and dying from the poor treatment, and the captor realized he could not allow prison conditions to deteriorate further.
Throughout captivity, prisoners were subjected to interrogations, many conducted under the conditions shown here. In the early years of the war, the interrogators were mainly interested in military information, such as types of aircraft flown, combat tactics used, and types of weapons employed. In these years, however, interrogations were largely unsuccessful, owing to general ineptness at interrogation, the language barrier, and lack of familiarity with the U.S. military. As an example of this lack of understanding, Navy pilots were often interrogated, or quizzed as the prisoners referred to it, on the supply system required to support the Navy task force in Southeast Asia. These interrogations, however, were often aimed at collecting detailed sketches of aircraft carriers, complete with diagrams of the holding pens for pigs and chickens. Later, the Vietnamese became more sophisticated and knowledgeable and could put much greater pressure on the prisoners.
Sign it. Then we will see that your arm is treated immediately.
You know I can't do that.
You are trying our patience, criminal.
I've given you all the information.
The greatest pressures, however, were usually reserved for efforts aimed at the extraction of propaganda
I
statements.
can't sign it.
Although the prisoners were usually successful in evading answers to military questions, there was little opportunity to evade when confronted with a propaganda statement. The prisoner had only two choices: to sign or not to sign. The most extensive campaign of political extortion was initiated in mid-1966, when the Vietnamese began trying to extract written confessions of what they termed war crimes. Prisoners were pressured to confess and apologize for violations of North Vietnamese airspace and for alleged bombings of churches, schools, hospitals, and other civilian facilities. The POWs were likewise pressured to praise the good treatment being accorded them and to submit written requests for the forgiveness of the Vietnamese people. The so-called War Crimes Program was launched with the infamous Hanoi March of July 1966, during which 52 POWs were marched through the streets of Hanoi and beaten, kicked, and stoned by an agitated crowd. Radio broadcasts described the hatred of the Vietnamese people and their demands that the prisoners be tried as war criminals. The only alternative to trial and execution, so the Vietnamese told the POWs, was to confess one's crimes and to assume a proper, that is, a cooperative attitude. In the face of these threats, not a single POW chose to comply. There followed a prolonged period of torture, during which the prisoners were humiliated as never before, and eventually coerced into writing the statements which the captor desired. Visiting delegations, both U.S. and foreign, were attracted by such statements, and all wanted to interview an American POW. These visitors were always taken to one of the showplace camps in Hanoi, where they would be allowed to view selected prisoners. The most frequently visited camp in the early years of the war is shown here and was known to the POWs as the plantation. Men were pressured and sometimes tortured to meet with visiting delegations and to recite memorized accounts of their humane treatment and anti-war sentiments. Prisoners were allowed special recreational privileges for the duration of these visits, as in this basketball game at another showplace camp, the Zoo. This particular camp was once a French officers' recreation center and later a major Vietnamese motion picture studio before becoming a prison facility in 1965. Rooms such as these were presented to visitors as typical of prisoner living conditions, when in fact nearly all POWs were confined at other camps under much different circumstances. Even though the prisoners could be coerced into meeting with visiting groups, they were often able to display very clearly the forced nature of their participation by remaining completely emotionless, and even more explicitly, by casually displaying an outright gesture of contempt for the cameraman.
The prisoners were constantly alert for ways to circumvent the Vietnamese efforts at isolation and exploitation, and consequently were usually able to maintain some degree of communication and organization. A major goal of all POW organizations is escape, and the prisoners in North Vietnam were no exception. Escape from North Vietnam, however, was extremely difficult, and there were in fact only several occasions on which U.S. POWs actually launched serious escape efforts. The camps themselves posed no great obstacle. Guard forces were small and not highly trained, and the only barrier to escape was often only a 6-foot fence. Once over that fence, however, the tall Caucasian in striped pajamas was hardly inconspicuous on the streets of Hanoi. Once out of Hanoi, he was still faced with many difficult miles of heavily populated territory where his race, language, and size, as well as a hostile populace, would make movement nearly impossible.
In October 1967, however, 2 prisoners did make a daring effort to escape. They found themselves loosely confined in a camp near the Hanoi thermal power plant, with the Red River only a few hundred yards away. Seizing on the opportunity, with almost no advanced preparation, the men easily escaped the camp and then entered the river, hoping to float out to sea, where perhaps they could contact a U.S. Navy patrol. The men floated downstream throughout the night, covering nearly 9 miles before morning. As dawn approached, the 2 were spotted by fishermen, who quickly recaptured them and returned them to Hanoi. On their return to Hanoi, the 2 escapees joined 9 other prisoners, senior men who had been designated as organizers and troublemakers, in a new camp nicknamed Alcatraz. This camp consisted of 11 isolation cells located in 2 small buildings within the North Vietnamese Ministry of National Defense, again located in downtown Hanoi. Within this camp, almost total solitary confinement and 14 hours a day in leg irons would be the rule for nearly 25 months, until the major improvement in treatment in late 1969.
Another escape was attempted on a rainy night in 1969, when 2 other prisoners launched a well-planned effort from the zoo. The 2 escapees left their cell through a hole in the ceiling and then, dressed as Vietnamese peasants, attempted to skirt the western edge of Hanoi, again hoping to reach the Red River and drift out to sea. The men were recaptured the next morning, however, after about 10 hours of freedom. The escapees and some other POWs at the zoo were subjected to days of beatings and interrogations as the Vietnamese tried to purge the prisoner leadership and destroy the prisoners' communication network.
This purge at the zoo was one of the last examples of really heavy torture in North Vietnam, because in October 1969, after over 4 years of often brutal treatment, the watershed was reached. The era of generally harsh conditions was replaced with an atmosphere of lighter punishment and improved living conditions. The Vietnamese showed themselves to be very concerned with their world image, as the commander of the Hanoi Hilton became the official scapegoat for the mounting publicity concerning the mistreatment of the prisoners. In a public apology to the people of North Vietnam, he was required to admit his misapplication of the government's lenient and humane policy toward captured personnel. The improved treatment was manifested in many ways. Additional clothing and blankets were issued, the cigarette ration was doubled from 3 to 6 per day, and the prisoners were allowed more time outside of their cells. The diet was also improved with the addition of noodles, more meat, and other items to the daily soup. Here is film footage released prior to 1969 by the Vietnamese in an attempt to depict the delicious and appetizing food routinely being served the prisoners. In reality, the POWs received such a meal only 2 or 3 times a year, on special occasions such as Tet, the Vietnamese New Year, and at Christmas. On all other days, they received only 2 meals, each consisting of a bowl of watery soup, generally pumpkin, and 2 small loaves of bread. Medical treatment also improved slightly in late 1969, but again, contrary to the propaganda films as shown here, care was seldom provided in professional hospital facilities. The most common medical problems included burns and fractures suffered during shoot-down and capture, as well as dysentery, gastric problems, and intestinal parasites. In the absence of professional medical care, the POWs developed their own remedies for many ailments, such as eating banana peels to control diarrhea and using toothpaste as an antiseptic cream.
During 1970, the slow, progressive improvement in treatment continued. Some men, however, continued in isolation in each camp, and the majority of the POWs were not allowed to write or receive letters even after 5 to 6 years of captivity. Frequent altercations with the guards continued, usually over the POWs' communication activities. At the same time, the POW organization improved in all camps in the reduced pressure atmosphere. In late 1970, as a result of the Son Tay raid, the Vietnamese were forced to consolidate all POWs in their most secure prison, the Hanoi Hilton. The prisoners were quick to capitalize on this unprecedented opportunity to consolidate their strength and soon created the organization that would last through the final 3 years in captivity, the 4th Allied POW Wing. The wing was composed of all 352 U.S. prisoners in the Hanoi Hilton, as well as 3 Thai POWs and a South Vietnamese Air Force lieutenant, thus making it an Allied organization. The wing was designated as the 4th because this was the 4th time in this century, after World Wars I, II, and the Korean War, that U.S. servicemen had been in captivity. The goal of the POWs was formalized in the selection of the wing motto, "Return with Honor." The wing was commanded by Major General John P. Flynn of the Air Force, at that time a colonel and the senior ranking man held prisoner. His staff included representatives of all services and extended down to each room in the Hilton, which was designated a squadron. The organization became quite complex and sophisticated, and as one returnee said, "We had everything except a wildlife control officer, and probably would have had that in a few more months."
The prisoners, of course, did not have access to movies such as My Fair Lady. But some POWs had often seen a particular movie several times, and they became known as movie tellers, one of the prisoners' answers to entertainment. One prisoner, for example, began in the early days of captivity with a simple recounting of the basic plot of My Fair Lady, lasting perhaps an hour. By the end of captivity, he was producing a 4 1/2-hour spectacular, complete with background music and lyrics. Another POW eventually developed an 8-hour version of Gone with the Wind. Other prisoners became experts at recounting novels, while others developed complete courses of instruction in subjects such as French, Spanish, American history, art appreciation, philosophy, thermodynamics, and even auto mechanics. These courses were taught not only to cellmates, but to interested prisoners throughout the camp, with lectures being transmitted from room to room by tapping on the walls. The intellectual stimulation of these educational activities was a welcome relief to those men who had spent years in isolation, with nothing to do but exercise, daydream, and observe in minute detail the lives of spiders, lizards, and other tiny creatures sharing their cells.
As the prisoners became more and more organized, and thus less susceptible to Vietnamese efforts to exploit or intimidate them, the relationship between the POWs and the captors slowly evolved into a live and let live philosophy. Each side established its own position and then refrained from provocative encroachments on the opposition's territory. The Vietnamese continued to probe the prisoners, however, always alert for an easy opportunity to propagandize or indoctrinate them. From the very first, the Vietnamese were eager to indoctrinate the prisoners in any way possible. In general, their efforts were not aimed at converting the POWs to communism, but rather more simply at lessening their faith in the U.S. government and its role in Southeast Asia. Prisoners were often lectured by camp officials who were always most ready to engage the POWs in philosophical discussions concerning the war. As in Korea, where the Chinese offered POWs the choice of either the reactionary or the progressive path, prisoners in Vietnam were confronted with the choice of the way of LBJ or the way of Ho Chi Minh. Failure to choose the right way meant poorer treatment, torture, and threats of life imprisonment or death.
Regardless of the indoctrination technique employed, the POWs were well aware that they were getting only one side of the true story. To combat this distortion of the news, the prisoners sometimes employed a method of news interpretation, which they referred to as 180-degree decoding. That is, they simply believed exactly the opposite of what the Vietnamese said. So, for example, when this news item was reported over the camp radio by Hanoi Hannah, the prisoners calculated that the particular Sunday in question was Easter Sunday, the day of the massive Easter parade in New York, and that the true story was probably something more like this.
As we noted earlier, the improvements in treatment beginning in late 1969 allowed the prisoners to recuperate greatly, both physically and mentally, from the preceding years of isolation, mistreatment, and physical abuse. If the prisoners had been released in mid-1969, we would have seen much poorer physical specimens returning from captivity. In the last months of imprisonment, beginning in September and October 1972, the Vietnamese even more markedly improved certain facets of POW life in the face of an imminent peace settlement. Extra food was distributed with special supplements for sick POWs. Men from all squadrons were allowed to mix outside more freely and to play volleyball, basketball, and other games. Some began to receive medical exams complete with chest x-rays. And finally, in the very last days of captivity, the Vietnamese began to recognize and deal with the leaders of the Fourth Wing, thus allowing the release itself to proceed smoothly under the direction of the wing's staff.
You've just seen some aspects of the captivity experience in Southeast Asia. What you have not seen, and what we cannot recreate for you, is an accurate portrayal of the intense emotional experiences which these men underwent in their many years of confinement. The life of a prisoner is not easy under any circumstances. When considering the major improvement in treatment in late 1969, one tends to conclude that captivity, although very tough before then, became almost bearable from that time on. But for the prisoner, the monotony, the anxieties, the fears, and the uncertainties of captivity continue through even the best periods of confinement. He lives in an environment almost totally devoid of one of man's most precious psychological commodities, a sense of security. That alone can have a tremendous debilitating effect through long years of confinement.
One might ask finally, how did captivity in Southeast Asia compare qualitatively with experiences in other wars? An answer to that question is found in the words of Air Force Colonel Richard Kern, a prisoner in Europe in 1944 and 1945, and again a prisoner for over 8 years in North Vietnam. He said, "Captivity with the Germans in World War II was rough, but I was treated like a human. My experience in Southeast Asia was completely unbelievable, indescribable, and not of this world."
Returned home with a sense of honor, with a pride and a faith in their country which amazed many Americans. But the lesson which they learned and displayed so openly was one instructed by Goethe years ago. What you have inherited from your fathers, earn over again for yourselves, or it will not be yours. These men had experienced a crisis of freedom as few other Americans have. They had been forced to examine themselves closely, to forego the pursuit of ease, and to rediscover the resources of vigor, faith, courage, and imagination which are required for survival. Intense thought, burning idealism, unlimited sacrifice. These were the attributes that made it possible for these men to return with honor.